Welcome to our channel. If you're looking for a calming, faith-filled escape into the nights, you're in the right place. The Story of a Tea Dargon. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss a moment of serenity. If this story brought you peace, I'd love to hear from you, so drop a comment below letting us know where you're watching from and what time you're tuning in. Thank you for being part of this journey. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. The soft glow of the evening sun faded beyond the hills as the meadow welcomed nightfall. David, the young shepherd boy, stood on the gentle slope, his staff resting lightly in his hand. His sheep moved lazily, nibbling the last tender blades of grass before they would settle for the night. The peaceful rhythm of the countryside mirrored the steady beat of David's heart, calm and trusting in the Lord who guided his every step. The stars began to emerge, one by one, pinpricks of light adorning the vast expanse above. A quiet song rose from his lips, a melody of praise and gratitude. The Lord is my shepherd, he sang softly, his voice blending with the gentle murmur of a nearby brook. Morning in the meadow was always a gentle awakening, but tonight, David's thoughts lingered on the lessons the day had taught him. As David moved among his sheep, he took note of the littlest lambs nestled close to their mothers. His hand rested briefly on one of them, its soft wool warm against his fingers. He was reminded of how the Lord, as the Good Shepherd, lovingly cares for each of his children. "You guide me as I guide these sheep," David murmured in prayer, his voice barely audible over the gentle rustle of the grass. The quiet hours of the night offered David a chance to reflect on the day's moments, those filled with challenges and those brimming with joy. Whether leading his flock to new grazing spots or protecting them from predators, he saw the hand of God in every moment. At the break of dawn, David led his flock toward the nearby brook. The cool waters sparkled in the morning light, a gentle reminder of the verse that had comforted him through many sleepless nights. He leads me beside still waters. The sheep, trusting David completely. As the water lapped softly against the stones, David knelt beside the brook, cupping his hands to drink. David thought of how God provided everything he needed, just as he provided for his flock. The water quenched their thirst, just as God's word nourished his soul. With each passing moment, the meadow and its surroundings became a living testimony of the Lord's provision and care. Sitting on a smooth rock beside the brook, David picked up his harp. As the sheep rested nearby, David thought of his role as a shepherd. David's song drifted upward, mingling with the gentle rustle of the meadow. "Lord, you are my shepherd," he sang once more, his voice carrying a quiet reverence. The peace he felt at that moment was indescribable, a gift from the one who watched over him as he watched over his flock. As the day gave way to another tranquil evening, David guided his flock back to the heart of the meadow. The soft glow of the setting sun cast a golden hue over the landscape, and the sheep settled into their familiar spots. The stillness of the evening was a gift, one that David cherished deeply. Rest was not just a pause from work. It was a reminder of God's provision and care. The meadow, bathed in the gentle light of the stars, seemed to echo his prayer. And as sleep claimed him, David's heart remained anchored in the peace that came from trusting in the Lord. The moon was high in the sky, casting silver beams across the meadow. The sheep were peacefully nestled. He recalled the times when a predator had prowled nearby. David's grip on his staff tightened momentarily as he listened to the night sounds. The distant cry of a wolf sent a ripple of tension through him, but he quickly breathed out a prayer. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, reaching for his harp, he began to play along with the symphony of the morning. The sheep stirred, rising one by one as the golden rays warmed the earth. The morning was cool as David led his flock along a familiar path. David thought about the many paths he had walked as a shepherd. Some led to still waters, while others wound through treacherous terrain. Yet, in every journey, God had guided him, just as he guided his sheep. "You make my path straight, Lord," he whispered, tapping his staff lightly on the ground. The sheep followed without hesitation, trusting David's lead. Midday brought warmth to the meadow, and David watched his sheep rest in the shade. One lamb, smaller and more curious than the others, wandered a little farther than it should have. The little lamb had found a patch of wildflowers and seemed delighted by its discovery, but David knew the danger of straying too far. As he carried the lamb back to the fold, David reflected on how often he had wandered from God's path, distracted by his own pursuits. Yet, just as he sought his sheep, the Lord always sought him and brought him back. The sun dipped lower in the sky, painting the meadow in hues of gold and amber. David sat down among them, leaning his back against a smooth rock. As he gazed at the first stars appearing in the twilight sky, closing his eyes, David let himself fully rest in God's presence. The evening brought with it a gentle breeze, carrying the scents of wild flowers and distant cedar trees. David often marveled at how the wind could not be controlled, yet it accomplished its purpose, guiding clouds across the sky or carrying seeds to new soil. As the wind danced through the grasses, David picked up his harp and played a soft tune. Night blanketed the meadow in deep indigo, and the stars shone like scattered jewels. That star had guided him on countless journeys, whether leading his flock to a new pasture or finding his way home. Its light had always been there. He thought of the many ways God had directed him, not just in the meadow, but in the decisions of his heart. The meadow came alive with tiny lights as fireflies flitted among the tall grass. The fireflies seemed to mirror the promises of God, small yet powerful beacons of hope in the darkness. David thought about how often God's reassurance came in quiet, unexpected ways, just as these tiny lights appeared without warning to brighten the night. Plucking the strings of his harp, David began to sing. The peaceful stillness of the night was interrupted by a distant howl. David's ears perked, his senses sharpening as he rose to his feet. He knew the sound of a wolf, and his heart quickened. Gripping his staff, David stood watch over the sheep. The house grew fainter, and the night returned to its calm rhythm. The first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon, and the meadow glistened with morning dew. The dew reminded him of the Lord's mercies, fresh and new with each dawn. As the sheep stirred, David began his morning routine. The day was warm, the sun casting long shadows over the meadow. As David sat beneath the old olive tree, his heart at rest. In the stillness, his thoughts turned to the many quiet moments he had spent in the Lord's presence. The Lord is my shepherd, David murmured again, as if saying it aloud would deepen the peace in his heart. It wasn't just a declaration, it was the foundation of his life. In every quiet moment, in every small decision, he knew that God was leading him, and with that knowledge he felt safe, knowing he could rest in the hands of the one who cared for him with such tenderness. As evening descended, David gathered his flock together, guiding them back to their resting place. Kneeling in the soft grass, David lifted his hands in a simple prayer, his voice quiet but full of reverence. His prayer was not long, but it was sincere. As the first stars began to appear in the sky, David felt a profound sense of connection to the Creator, the shepherd of his soul. The morning sun kissed the meadow with its warmth, and David led his flock toward the gentle stream that ran through the valley. The water was clear and inviting, and the sound of it flowing over smooth stones brought a sense of calm to David's heart. He knelt beside the water, dipping his hands into the cool stream. The sheep drank eagerly, their thirst quenched by the refreshing waters. As the day grew warmer, David's thoughts turned to the times when the journey was not easy. Sitting on a large stone, David gazed over his flock, reflecting on the times when the Lord had strengthened him in moments of weakness. His heart swelled with gratitude for the Lord's faithfulness. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow across the meadow, David gathered his sheep for the night. He could feel the weariness in his bones, but there was a deep peace within him. The sheep settled in for the night, their soft bleats and the gentle rustling of the grass the only sounds in the stillness. David stretched out on the soft earth, his back against a sturdy rock, his heart full of gratitude. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. As the stars filled the sky, David closed his eyes and let sleep overtake him. The moon was high and full, casting a gentle light across the meadow. It was his own voice, singing a melody of praise to the Lord. His words were carried on the wind, the melody mingling with the stillness of the night. The dawn broke gently, the early light painting the meadow in hues of lavender and gold. As he surveyed the flock, David thought of the strength required to be a shepherd, not just physical strength, but a strength of heart. It wasn't always easy to lead his flock, especially when the terrain was rough or the journey long. Yet in every moment, God had been his strength. My help comes from the Lord, David murmured, recalling the verse that had been his anchor through countless trials. David's strength wasn't in his own ability, but in his unwavering trust in God. The sun climbed higher, casting its warmth over the meadow as David led his flock to the stream. The water was clear, and the sound of its gentle flow filled the air with peace. As he watched the water flow, David was reminded of God's love, steadfast, pure, and always flowing. He thought of how the water, though unhurried, brought life to everything it touched. David sat in the quiet, allowing the peaceful stream to echo the stillness in his heart. But the stars had begun to twinkle above the meadow, and the air had grown cool with the approach of night. David's senses were alert, but he felt a deep sense of peace. He saw behind him and splashed over with his lightning boat. As the hours passed, the night seemed to settle. The first light of dawn broke through the trees, and the meadow slowly came alive with the sounds of a new day. There was joy in his heart as he watched the sheep follow him. "The joy of the Lord is my strength," David whispered, smiling as the sheep followed him with trust and peace. As he walked, David hummed a song of praise, his heart overflowing with gratitude. Every step he took was a reminder of God's faithfulness, and the joy he felt in that moment was the fruit of a life spent following the shepherd's call. As the day drew to a close, David led his flock toward the resting place for the night. David could feel the weight of the day lifting from his shoulders. The work of the shepherd was never truly finished, but there was a certain peace in knowing that God had been with him through every moment. "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened," David whispered, recalling the words of the Lord. The invitation to rest was not just physical. It was a call to the soul, a reminder that in God there was true peace. The night was peaceful, the stars scattered across the sky like precious gems. David thought of the countless times the Lord had provided for him, guided him, and protected him. The words of the psalm echoed in his heart. As the first light of morning kissed the meadow, David rose, stretching as the warmth of the sun enveloped him. David looked around, marveling at the beauty of God's creation. He knelt down in the soft grass, his heart full of awe and reverence. The beauty of the meadow reminded David that God's creation was a reflection of his heart, a heart that cared for each detail, from the smallest blade of grass to the vast sky above. The day was warm. David's thoughts turned to the psalm that had been his heart's song for so many years. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." He had learned that trusting God wasn't always about understanding every step of the journey. It was about knowing that He was good and that He was always with him. As the evening settled over the meadow, David gathered his flock once again, leading them to their resting place for the night. David sat beside the flock, his heart content, knowing that his work was done for the day. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," David whispered, repeating the words that had been the foundation of his life. As he closed his eyes, he felt the gentle peace that only God could provide. In that moment, David knew that the shepherd's rest was not just for the night, but for his soul. And so, in the quiet of the meadow, under the watchful stars, David rested. "Do not be afraid, for I have faith in God." The waves tossed the ship mercilessly as the storm raged around them. The sky had turned an angry gray, and the winds howled like a wild animal tearing at the sails. Amid the chaos stood Paul, the apostle, steady and unshaken. He had been through many storms before, both literal and spiritual. Paul's prayers, soft and steady, were a contrast to the turmoil around him. The crew, gripped by fear, ran frantically from one side of the ship to the other, trying to secure the sails and the ropes. Their faces were pale and their voices trembled as they shouted orders to one another. But no matter what they did, the storm only grew worse. Some of the men prayed to their gods, some yelled for help, but none of their efforts seemed to make a difference. The wind continued to howl, and the waves crashed against the ship with such force that it felt as though they might be shattered at any moment. Amidst the panic, Paul walked calmly across the deck, his steps steady, as if he were walking on solid ground. He made his way toward the crew and called to them in a voice that carried above the roar of the storm. "Brothers, do not be afraid," he called out, his voice firm yet filled with compassion. "I have faith in God that we will be safe. He has spoken to me, and his promise will come to pass." The crew members, exhausted and desperate, turned to look at him. The storm raged through the night, and as the hours passed, the crew grew weaker. In the midst of the storm, as he sat in the quiet of the ship's hold, he closed his eyes and recalled that vision. Paul felt a deep sense of peace as he meditated on these words. The morning light had yet to pierce the heavy clouds, and the storm showed no signs of relenting. Paul, however, remained steady. He had spent the night in prayer, trusting in God's word and waiting for the right moment to speak. "Take heart, my friends," he said, his eyes meeting theirs with unwavering certainty. The crew listened in silence, the fear in their hearts momentarily replaced by the assurance of Paul's calm. "We may face rough waters, but we will reach the shore." The storm eventually began to subside, though the wind still howled faintly in the distance. The crew, exhausted but filled with a new-found sense of hope, gathered on deck to survey the damage. Paul stood quietly at the bow of the ship, his heart full of gratitude. He had not only trusted in God's promise, but had shared that trust with the crew. His unwavering faith had been a beacon of light to them in the darkest hours. As the waves gently rocked the ship, Paul whispered a prayer of thanksgiving. The crew, now filled with peace, gathered around him, their hearts lifted by the assurance that God's hand had guided them through the storm. The sun was now fully rising, casting its golden rays over the water, which had begun to settle into a gentle rhythm. Paul sat on a crate near the bow of the ship, quietly reflecting on the night's events. His heart was still brimming with gratitude, and he couldn't help but think about the way God had spoken to him during the storm. In the midst of the chaos, Paul had felt God's presence like never before. There had been a moment when the winds were at their strongest that he had heard God's voice so clearly in his heart, urging him to stay calm, to trust. God's words had been a gentle whisper amid the roaring winds, a reminder that He was in control. Do not be afraid. Paul closed his eyes, remembering that moment. As the crew worked to repair the ship and prepare for the journey ahead, Paul continued to speak words of encouragement. Paul spoke of God's faithfulness, reminding them that the storm had not come by chance, nor had it been a sign of abandonment. His words, full of conviction and peace, brought a sense of calm to the crew. Despite the damage to the ship, despite the weary bodies and tired spirits, Paul continued to trust in God's promise. I trust in the promise He gave me, Paul said quietly to one of the sailors. As the hours passed, the crew began to feel the weight of the storm lift from their shoulders. Paul, though physically tired, felt a deep sense of renewal. He walked the deck, offering words of encouragement to the sailors and checking on those who had been particularly shaken by the storm. Though they were still exhausted, the peace that Paul radiated was contagious, and one by one, the men began to find their bearings again. For Paul, the storm had not only tested his faith, it had strengthened it. It had reminded him that no matter how fierce the storm, God was his anchor. His heart was at rest, knowing that the God who had seen him through the night would continue to guide him. As the day wore on, Paul found a quiet moment to sit and reflect on everything that had happened. Even in the most uncertain of times, God had always been there, leading Paul, teaching him, and reminding him of his promises. All knew that life would always have its storms. There would always be moments when the seas would feel uncertain, when the winds would threaten to knock him down. Great is thy faithfulness, Paul whispered as he reflected on the truth of God's unchanging love. As the ship set sail once more, the crew was ready. Paul stood at the bow of the ship, gazing out at the horizon. Thank you, Lord, Paul whispered. The crew, feeling the peace that had settled over them, began to relax. In that moment, Paul's calm faith was a reminder that no matter what came next, they were not alone. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a soft orange glow across the sea, the ship sailed on in peaceful silence. Paul sat alone on the deck, gazing up at the stars. Paul closed his eyes and whispered a prayer of gratitude. As he prayed, he felt the gentle rocking of the ship beneath him, as if the waves were singing a lullaby. The ship sailed steadily into the night, and the crew settled into their routine. Paul, still calm and steady, walked along the deck, occasionally stopping to speak with the sailors. He encouraged them to keep their hearts open to God's guidance, to remember that no matter what came next, they were not alone. "Remember the promise," Paul said softly to one of the sailors, who had been particularly shaken by the storm. The sailor nodded, his eyes filled with gratitude. "I'll hold on to that, Paul. Thank you for your faith. It has given us strength." Paul smiled gently. "It is not my faith that will carry us. It is God's faithfulness. And that never fails." The night passed quietly, and as dawn approached, Paul found a quiet corner of the ship where he could sit and reflect on all that had transpired. He thought back to the moments when the storm had felt as though it would consume them, when the winds howled so loudly it was hard to hear anything else. That trust had carried him through the night. He opened his Bible. As the ship sailed on, the winds grew calm, and the water settled into a smooth, glass-like surface. Paul gathered the crew once more. Crew nodded, their hearts lighter as they prepared for the final leg of the journey. Paul's words had been a constant source of reassurance, and now, with the land in sight, they knew they could face whatever came next with courage and faith. Paul smiled, his heart full of gratitude. The ship was now only hours away from reaching its destination. The crew moved with purpose, preparing for their arrival. Paul stood at the bow of the ship, watching as the land drew nearer. His heart was filled with both peace and anticipation. He knew that they were about to reach a new chapter in their journey, but he also knew that the lessons learned during the storm would stay with them. As he looked at the horizon, he thought of the promise God had made to him. The storm had been fierce. As the ship drew nearer to the shore, the crew's sense of anticipation grew. The storm had taught him many things, but most of all, it had reaffirmed his trust in God's guidance. He had felt the fear and uncertainty that came with the violent winds, but he had also felt the peace that came from trusting in God's promises. "We are almost there," Paul said to the crew, his voice calm and steady. "And though the sea was treacherous, our God has brought us through. Let us remember this moment and give thanks." The crew nodded, their faces reflecting the same quiet gratitude. As the ship finally docked on the shore, the crew disembarked one by one. As the sailors and soldiers gathered their belongings and prepared to move inland, Paul paused for a moment to look back at the sea. "God has brought us safely here," Paul whispered to himself, "and He will continue to guide us in whatever comes next." The crew followed his example, taking a few moments to reflect on the journey. Once they had gathered their things and set up camp on the shore, the crew took a much-needed rest. Paul found a quiet spot by a small fire and sat down, closing his eyes for a moment to give thanks. The warmth of the fire, the sound of the crackling wood, and the cool night air all combined to bring a sense of comfort. He thought about the words of the angel he had seen in the storm, the words that had comforted him and given him strength. In that moment, Paul felt God's faithfulness wash over him once again. As the days passed, the crew rested and prepared for the next phase of their journey. God's provision wasn't just about safety during the storm. It was about the quiet moments that followed, the stillness of the land, the calmness of the sea. Paul took a deep breath and gave thanks. It was easy to focus on the storm, on the hardship and fear that had come with it. But the real beauty was in the way God had provided for them, not just in the storm, but in the peaceful moments that followed. "Lord, thank you for your provision." In the midst of the quiet, Paul realized that God's provision was always present, whether in the chaos or the calm. One evening, as the stars appeared in the sky once again, Paul gathered the crew to reflect on the journey they had been through. "We have learned much through this trial," Paul said, his voice calm but full of conviction. The crew listened intently, many of them still in awe of how Paul had remained so calm and faithful throughout the storm. "Do not be afraid," Paul continued. The crew nodded, their hearts full of peace. The morning sun rose gently over the horizon, casting a warm glow across the landscape. The storm had been a time of testing, of fear, and of uncertainty. He gathered the crew together, his voice calm and steady. The crew nodded, their hearts filled with a renewed sense of purpose. The storm was behind them, but the peace that had come from trusting in God would stay with them. As they began to move inland, the crew encountered new challenges. The unknown had always been a source of fear for many, but for Paul, it was an invitation to trust even more deeply. God will lead us, Paul said as they walked. The crew, encouraged by Paul's unwavering faith, continued their journey. As they traveled further into the land, the days grew longer. One evening, as they sat around the fire, Paul shared with them the importance of finding peace in the journey itself, not just in the destination. The storm taught us many things, Paul said, his voice calm and reflective. The crew listened, their hearts quieting as they thought about Paul's words. It was easy to think that peace was something to be earned or achieved at the end of a trial. But Paul had learned that true peace came from surrendering to God's will in every moment, whether in the storm or on calm shores. As the journey continued, Paul often took moments to reflect on God's faithfulness in each step they took. As Paul walked alongside the crew, he noticed how God was providing for their needs in ways they might have overlooked. They were given food when they were hungry, shelter when they needed rest, and strength when the journey felt long. God is faithful, Paul said one day as they stopped to rest. He provides for us in ways we may not always see, but His provision is constant, steady, and sure. Even in the smallest details, He is there. The crew took comfort in these words, knowing that God's faithfulness was evident in the little things. As the days passed and the crew made their way further inland, they encountered more obstacles. He often spoke of hope, the hope that anchored them through the storms of life. One evening, as they gathered around the fire once again, Paul shared a final thought before they settled into sleep. The crew, encouraged by Paul's words, found rest in the hope that God had given them. The journey had been long, and the crew had encountered many challenges. Paul stopped walking for a moment, taking in the beauty of the scene. It was a reminder that, no matter how difficult the journey, there were always moments of peace to be found along the way. He turned to the crew, his voice soft but firm. The crew paused as well, breathing in the calmness of the valley. As they continued their journey, Paul often spoke to the crew about the importance of resting in God's timing. We may not understand understand why things happen the way they do," Paul said one evening. The crew began to reflect on these words, realizing how often they had been eager to rush through their trials. Despite the many hardships they faced, Paul's strength was not in his physical prowess, but in his quiet, steadfast faith. He had learned that true strength came from resting in God's promises, even when the situation seemed impossible. One day, as they traveled through a particularly rough stretch of land, one of the crew members remarked on how calm Paul remained, even in the face of adversity. "Paul, how is it that you never seem to lose your peace?" Paul smiled, his eyes filled with a quiet confidence. "It is not me who remains calm," he replied. "It is the peace of God that fills my heart. My strength comes not from my own ability to withstand the storm, but from the assurance that God is with me always. His presence is my anchor, and it gives me the strength to face whatever comes." The crew member nodded, his heart stirred by Paul's words. As they neared the end of their journey, Paul took a moment to reflect on the path they had traveled together. He thought back to the storm, to the fear and uncertainty that had threatened to overwhelm them, and how far they had come since then. They had faced dangers, hardships, and moments of doubt, but through it all, they had held on to the hope that God was with them. "You know," Paul said to the crew. The crew listened intently, understanding that Paul was not just speaking about the journey they had shared, but about a much greater truth. As they moved closer to their final destination, the crew felt a sense of gratitude for the lessons they had learned from Paul. The journey was almost over, but the lessons from the storm would stay with them forever. We have traveled far, and we have faced many challenges. The crew nodded, their hearts filled with peace. The storm had tested them, but it had also strengthened their faith. They knew that whatever lay ahead, they were anchored in the hope that God would never leave them or forsake them. As they continued on, the crew felt a deep sense of peace. And Mary said, "My soul magnifies the Lord, and my spirit rejoices in God my Savior." The evening sun dipped below the horizon, casting a soft orange glow over the humble village of Nazareth. The narrow streets grew quieter as the day's work came to a close, and the faint murmur of distant conversations faded into the silence of the evening. In a modest home tucked at the edge of the village, Mary sat in the quiet solitude of her room, a flickering candle casting gentle shadows on the walls. Her heart was at peace, yet it was filled with the weight of a promise that only she could truly understand. She gazed at the candlelight, its warm glow bringing a sense of calm and comfort. As the candle flickered softly, Mary's mind drifted back to the day when the angel had come to her. So unexpected, yet so full of grace. Mary could still remember the wonder, the awe, and the deep reverence she felt in that moment. Mary touched her hand gently to her heart, feeling the movement within her, the reminder of that divine promise. Mary's gaze drifted out the window, where the evening stars began to appear in the sky. Her thoughts turned to the words she had spoken to the angel. The surrender to God's will brought with it a quiet assurance. Mary's thoughts continued to flow gently, like the flickering candlelight that illuminated her room. As she reflected on her journey, she realized how deeply her soul had been changed by this encounter with the divine. The peace that came with trusting in God's plan and become a constant companion. And in these quiet moments, it felt almost as though she could hear her soul whispering in harmony with the Lord. It was a peace that did not come from worldly understanding, but from the deep knowing that God's ways were far greater than her own. My soul magnifies the Lord, she whispered aloud, letting the words settle in her heart. The room had grown darker now, the candle's flame dancing softly in the quiet air. She prayed not for her own understanding, but for strength to carry out the task that had been entrusted to her. The candlelight flickered once more, its flame steady and sure. The evening deepened, and the soft light of the candle cast long shadows on the walls. Mary thought of the times she had walked the village paths, seeking the Lord in the quiet of the morning. As the candle flickered, Mary felt a deep sense of connection to the Lord, knowing that His light had come into the world in the most unexpected way, through her. The night grew still, and the air became cooler, the gentle breeze carrying the scent of the earth. In the stillness, she felt a deep stirring within, a quiet reassurance that God's plan for her life was unfolding as it should. The Holy Spirit had been with her since the moment of the angel's visit, and now, in this moment of prayer, Mary could sense His presence more closely than ever. Her spirit rejoiced in the quiet companionship of the Holy Spirit, who was her constant guide and comforter. The stars outside shone brightly, their soft light casting a heavenly glow over the landscape. How would Joseph respond to the news? How would others in the village react? So many questions filled her mind, but as she thought of them, there was a quiet assurance that the Lord would lead her. The path ahead was unseen, but it was guided by the hands of the Creator. Your ways are higher than my ways, O Lord, she whispered, letting the weight of those words sink deep into her heart. She didn't have to know the details of the journey, only that the Lord would provide what she needed for each step along the way. In that quiet moment, Mary knew that trusting God meant embracing the unknown with open hands. The candlelight flickered gently, casting a soft glow over Mary's face as she knelt in quiet prayer. My soul magnifies the Lord, she sang softly, her voice barely above a whisper. The words of her song were a quiet, intimate expression of her joy. The song flowed from her heart like a river, unhurried and full of love. As the night stretched on, Mary's prayer deepened, and her heart grew even more at peace. The stillness of the night was soothing, and the warmth of the candlelight was like a quiet embrace. The journey ahead might be long, and the road might be uncertain. Rest in me, she whispered, feeling the peace of the Lord filling her heart. Mary closed her eyes and breathed softly. Mary closed her eyes and breathed deeply, allowing the peace of the Lord to envelop her. The night was deep, and the stars above twinkled like the promises of God, each one reflecting a piece of His faithfulness. Mary sat silently by the candle, her thoughts drifting softly like the night breeze. She was no longer concerned with the questions that had once filled her mind, the uncertainties about the future, or the challenges she would face. In this moment, there was only quiet trust, a trust that was unwavering. Mary closed her eyes, resting her hands gently in her lap, and she could feel God's presence surrounding her like a warm embrace. Though her journey had only just begun, Mary already felt a strength within her that could only come from God. It was a quiet strength, one that didn't rely on human effort but on the faithfulness of the Creator. My soul magnifies the Lord, Mary whispered, allowing the words to fill her heart once again. The candle flickered softly, casting a serene light over the room. She remembered the angel's words and the message that had changed her life. Do not be afraid, Mary, for you have found favor with God. God's plan was good, Mary knew, and it was unfolding step by step. As As the night deepened, the room grew even quieter. It was a peace that came from knowing that she was loved by God, that He had called her, and that He was with her every step of the way. The peace settled into her soul, and for a moment she felt the weight of the world lift from her shoulders. Mary sat with her hands resting gently in her lap. In this sacred silence, Mary felt a deep communion with God. Her prayer wasn't a request, it was an offering of herself to the Lord, an offering of trust that His will was good, even when it was beyond her understanding. As the candlelight flickered gently, Mary remained in that sacred space of prayer, allowing the peace of God to fill her completely. The candlelight flickered gently as Mary sat in the stillness of her room. In the stillness, she thought about the rhythm of time and how the Lord worked through it. "Your timing is perfect, Lord," Mary whispered softly. As the evening wore on, the shadows in Mary's room lengthened, but the warmth of the candlelight remained. She thought of the words the angel had spoken to her, words that had seemed so incredible at the time, but now felt like a deep, unshakable truth. "The Lord is with you. Thank you for your constant presence, Lord," Mary prayed quietly. The night was now fully upon her, and the air had become cool and crisp. Trusting God had not always been easy. "Blessed is she who has believed that the Lord would fulfill His promises to her," she whispered, recalling the words of Elizabeth. Mary closed her eyes and bowed her head in silent prayer, her heart open and receptive to whatever God had in store. There was a deep sense of peace that came from surrendering her will to God's, from trusting that He knew what was best for her. In the stillness, Mary felt her heart aligning more and more with God's purposes. As the night deepened, the world outside remained still. Day. She rested in that love now, knowing that it was more than enough to sustain her. Her heart was full, not of fear or uncertainty, but of the quiet, steady assurance that God's love was all she needed. It was a love that would see her through every moment, every step, and every breath. Mary sat still in the soft glow of the candlelight, her heart at rest. The days since the angel's visit had been filled with uncertainty, but as she sat in this quiet moment, Mary felt a deep sense of peace that came from surrendering to God's perfect plan. She didn't need to know all the details of what lay ahead. She closed her eyes and whispered a prayer of surrender. As the night stretched on, Mary thought of all that had been promised to her. She thought of the food that had been provided, the shelter that surrounded her, and the love of her family. Her heart swelled with gratitude as she realized that God's provision was not just material. Mary smiled softly and whispered, "Thank you, Lord, for your provision." A candle flickered as Mary sat in prayer. Her heart connected to God's in a way that was both intimate and deep. Though her life had changed in ways she could never have imagined, prayer had remained a steady foundation. Mary knew that the power of prayer was not in the words spoken, but in the act of surrendering her heart to God. It was in prayer that she could lay down her worries, her fears, and her doubts, knowing that God would carry them for her. In the stillness of her room, Mary thought about the joy that had come from her obedience to God. It wasn't always easy to say yes to His call, especially when the future seemed unclear and filled with unknowns. But now, as she sat in prayer, she realized that obedience to God had brought her a joy that she could not find anywhere else. The joy was not in the absence of challenges, but in the deep satisfaction of knowing she was walking in God's will. Each step of obedience had brought her closer to Him, and with each step, her heart had been filled with a joy that surpassed the circumstances of her life. "Your ways are perfect, Lord," she whispered. Mary knew that obedience wasn't about perfection. It was about faithfulness, and in her faithfulness, she had found the deep joy that only comes from walking closely with God. As the candlelight flickered in the quiet room, Mary felt her body relax, releasing the tension of the day. It was a peace that came not from the absence of challenges, but from the knowledge that her life was in God's hands. Mary closed her eyes and allowed herself to sink into the comfort of that peace. In that quiet surrender, she felt the peace of God flood her heart. The candle's light flickered as Mary sat in the quiet room, her heart open and expectant. The beauty of God's promises was not just in their fulfillment, but in the way they brought peace to her soul. They were like the gentle stars above, a reminder that God was always faithful, always present. He thought of the promise of the Messiah, the promise that had been made long ago. With a soft sigh, as the night stretched on, Mary closed her eyes and listened to the silence. In those moments of quiet, when the world around her seemed to fade away, Mary could hear the voice of the Lord guiding her, reassuring her, and calling her to a deeper trust. Speak, Lord, your servant is listening. As the evening wore on, Mary's heart turned to the child within her. She rested her hand gently on her belly, feeling the child within her. In this moment, she felt a deep connection to God's plan. She knew that He would guide her, strengthen her, and walk with her every step of the way. Lord, I trust you with this child, she whispered. The room was now filled with the peaceful stillness of the night, and Mary sat quietly, her heart content in the presence of God. It was in His presence that she found the deepest peace, a peace that could not be shaken by the circumstances around her. As she reflected on the days that had passed and the path that lay ahead, she felt a sense of calm assurance. God's presence was all she needed, and in that presence there was nothing to fear. The Lord is with me, she whispered softly. I will not fear. Mary closed her eyes and rested in the knowledge that God's presence was always with her. As the candle burned low, the night seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the dawn. The child she carried was the hope of the world, and though she did not fully understand the magnitude of this calling, she knew that with God's help, she would be ready. Mary smiled softly as she thought of the future. With those words, she allowed herself to rest, in the hope that only God could give. Never left the temple, but worshipped night and day, fasting and praying, Luke 2:37, in the quiet hours of the night. Though the world beyond the temple was full of noise and distractions, here, in the stillness, Anna had found peace. As she knelt before the altar, her thoughts turned to the promises that God had made to His people. She knew that the Messiah would come, and though she had waited so long, she felt no bitterness. Instead, she felt a quiet joy, knowing that her waiting was part of God's perfect plan. Anna's life had not always been one of prayer and fasting. She had once been married, her days filled with the joy of a family. But her husband had passed away after only 7 years of marriage, leaving her to carry on alone. In her grief, Anna had turned to God, finding solace in His presence. Now, many years later, Anna was known by all who visited the temple for her unwavering faith. She had become a living example of what it meant to trust God, not just in moments of joy, but in times of trial. Her eyes, though aged, shone with the light of a deep and abiding hope. As Anna sat in the temple, she knew that her life was not one of waiting in vain. The temple was not a place of silence. There were always sounds, soft whispers, the murmur of prayers rising up to God. Night after night, Anna would sit in the sacred halls, her eyes focused on the altar, her heart lifted in worship. During these moments, Anna often thought of the words of the prophets, of the promise that one day the Messiah would come. In the quiet moments of her vigil, Anna often found herself reflecting on the many years she had spent waiting. Waiting had not made her impatient. It had deepened her relationship with God. Though others may have seen her waiting as a form of deprivation or loss, Anna knew it was the greatest gift. She was waiting for something greater than she could have ever imagined. One evening, as Anna sat in her quiet place within the temple, she felt a stirring in her spirit. It was then that she saw them, the young couple entering the temple with a baby in their arms. Anna's eyes immediately fixed on the child. There was something about him. Tears welled up in Anna's eyes as she took the child in her arms. As Anna held the infant Jesus in her arms, she was overcome with emotion. Anna gently rocked the baby in her arms, her lips moving in quiet praise. She could hardly find the words to express the depth of her joy, for there were no words that could adequately convey the overwhelming sense of peace and fulfillment she felt. The infant's small hands grasped her fingers, and Anna smiled. Simon, an elder of the temple who had long awaited the Messiah's arrival, was present in the temple that day as well. "Anna," Simeon said, his voice tremulous with emotion, "you have witnessed what we have all longed for." Anna nodded, still cradling the child in her arms. Simeon took a step closer, his hands trembling as he reached out to gently touch the child. Anna smiled through her tears. She too had waited for this moment. After Anna had returned the child to his mother, Mary, she remained in the temple, her heart still full of praise. As the quiet moments passed, Anna knelt before the altar once again. "Lord," Anna whispered, "thank you for this moment. Thank you for allowing me to see your salvation." Her words were soft, but full of conviction, echoing in the stillness of the temple. As the days passed, Anna continued her quiet vigil in the temple. In the silence of the temple, Anna reflected on the years of waiting that had brought her to this point. Patience, she realized, was not a passive waiting, but an active choice to trust in God's timing. It was not about rushing ahead or demanding answers, but about surrendering to the knowledge that God's plan was unfolding in His perfect way. And for Anna, the reward of her patience was greater than she could have ever imagined. As the temple grew quiet once more, Anna felt a deep sense of peace settle in her heart. Anna gazed around the temple, her eyes lingering on the flickering candles and the soft shadows cast by the stone walls. With a quiet smile, she knelt in prayer once again, offering her thanks to God. In the stillness of the temple, Anna sat in her familiar place of prayer, her heart resting in the quiet assurance of God's faithfulness. The days after the presentation passed slowly, but Anna's spirit was steadfast. As she knelt in prayer, a soft whisper seemed to brush her soul, reminding her that God's faithfulness was never limited by time. She had learned that the waiting, the quiet moments of surrender, were not just about anticipating a future event, but about cultivating a relationship with God in the present. Anna knew that the Messiah's arrival was not the end of her journey, but the beginning of something even greater, a mission of hope and salvation for all the world. Evangelist. One afternoon, Anna found herself alone in the temple, sitting beneath the towering columns and reflecting on her life. She had seen so many generations pass through this sacred place, each one bringing their own hopes, dreams, and prayers. She had witnessed the unfolding of history, from the promise of the coming Messiah to the birth of that promise in the humble child Jesus. Her thoughts turned to the many other women and men who had waited before her, those who had prayed for the coming of the Savior, but who had never seen his arrival. And yet, she knew that her witness was not just for herself. She had been given the gift of seeing the Messiah, not just for the joy of it, but to share the hope of his arrival with others. As Anna stood by the temple's great doors, gazing out over the streets of Jerusalem, she felt the presence of the child Jesus still with her. Anna's heart swelled with the knowledge that her waiting had been a part of a much larger plan. Her heart burned with an urge to tell others, to share the good news that the Messiah had come. As days turned to weeks, Anna found herself drawn deeper into her quiet worship. She had learned that reverence was not just a posture of the body, but a posture of the heart. To truly revere God was to place Him at the center of all things. To make every moment an offering, every breath an act of worship. And so she continued in her devotion, offering her prayers for the Messiah's work in the world, and asking for strength to continue her mission. In the quiet hours of the night, when the temple was still and the stars glimmered in the sky above, Anna often thought about her life. She had not lived a life of grand fame or accomplishment by the world's standards. She had not traveled the world or built a mighty empire. Anna had lived her days in the temple, worshipping, praying, fasting, and waiting. Her life had not been filled with the kind of accolades that the world values, but Anna knew that she had lived with purpose. She had kept her heart and mind focused on God, and in doing so, she had been part of the greatest story ever told. As she sat in the quiet temple, Anna felt a deep sense of fulfillment. In the solitude of the temple, Anna felt the steady rhythm of life as it unfolded around her. Anna had never sought recognition or accolades for her devotion. Her heart's desire had always been to honor God and remain steadfast in her faith. She had seen the world change in so many ways during her lifetime, but one thing had remained constant: God's faithfulness. That faithfulness had sustained her through the years of waiting, and it was the foundation of her peace. As she knelt in prayer one evening, her heart full of gratitude, Anna realized that her life had indeed been purposeful. She had not been called to a life of public recognition or influence, but to one of quiet faithfulness. Her devotion in the temple, her prayers for the Messiah, had served a higher purpose than she could ever imagined. Each morning, as the first light of dawn began to filter through the temple windows, Anna would rise and begin her prayers. Her heart was always full of gratitude and adoration for the Lord, but it was also a heart that sought guidance. She prayed for the people of Israel, that they would recognize the Savior and embrace the truth he brought. As the hours passed, Anna's prayers took on a deeper, more intimate tone. Anna had always embraced the passage of time with grace. Her long years of waiting had taught her to understand the rhythm of life. In the temple, she continued her quiet vigil, remaining faithful to her calling. Her years of waiting had not been wasted, for in each moment, God had been preparing her for this season of fulfillment. Though Anna had spent most of her life in the quiet solitude of the temple, her heart was never alone. Anna never spoke loudly or sought attention. Her presence was a quiet testimony to the power of faith, devotion, and trust in God's promises. Anna was a living example of what it meant to live a life of surrender, to place all one's hopes and dreams in God's hands, trusting that He would guide each step. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the temple grew quiet, Anna sat by the soft glow of a candle, reflecting on the coming days, and prayed for those who would come after her, that they would hold fast to the hope of the Savior. As Anna sat there, her heart full of hope for the future, she knew that the work of God was not finished. As the days passed, Anna's life remained rooted in prayer, her heart always drawn toward God's presence. The temple was filled with those who came to offer sacrifices and seek God's guidance, but Anna knew that her devotion was different. It wasn't just about the formality of worship. It was about the deep, intimate connection she had with her Savior. She had spent years cultivating a life of prayer, each word spoken with sincerity, each moment in worship drawing her closer to the God who had been her refuge. As she knelt in the temple, Anna's mind often wandered to the promise of the Messiah. The seasons in the temple changed, as they did everywhere. The cold of winter would give way to the warmth of spring, and the heat of summer would eventually fade into the cooler days of autumn. For her, each season was a reminder of God's faithfulness. Just as the earth went through cycles of renewal, so too did her heart. Each season of waiting, each moment of anticipation, had prepared her for this time. Anna often thought of those who had waited for the Messiah before her, those who had longed for the promise but did not live to see it. She wondered how they had felt during their own seasons of waiting. Anna had lived through many changes in her life. The city of Jerusalem had seen many rulers, wars, and times of peace. In the quiet moments of her days, Anna would reflect on the changes she had seen in her lifetime. Anna knew that even though the world around her was in constant flux, God's peace was unshakable. Anna had spent years waiting, and she had learned that waiting was not a passive experience. Every moment of prayer, every quiet hour spent in the temple, had been an opportunity to draw closer to the heart of God. She could look back on all the years of waiting and know that God had been with her every step of the way. One evening, as Anna sat in the temple, a deep stirring in her heart began to grow. Anna knew that the Messiah's work was just beginning, and she understood that it was her role to speak of his coming to those who had not yet heard. Her heart was full of hope for the future, and she could no longer keep the joy of the Savior's arrival to herself. She had witnessed the fulfillment of God's promises, and she knew that the world needed to hear about the light that had come into the darkness. As Anna prepared to step out of the quiet temple and into the world, she felt the presence of God's peace surround her. She knew that her words, though simple, would be powerful. Anna Anna's decision to share the news of the Messiah spread quickly. Though she had lived a quiet life, her words were powerful, as they were filled with the truth of what she had witnessed. Each person who listened to her testimony seemed to leave with a sense of hope and anticipation. As the days passed, Anna's words began to ripple outward from the temple, reaching the homes of many who had not yet heard. As Anna walked through the streets of Jerusalem, she saw the faces of those around her with a new sense of purpose. She noticed the weary travelers and the tired souls who wandered without direction. Anna prayed silently as she walked among them, asking God to open their hearts to the truth. In the quiet moments of her walks, Anna smiled to herself. The faces around her were no longer strangers, but part of the great tapestry of God's plan. Though Anna was filled with joy and purpose, she never lost sight of the patience that had marked her life. She knew that even with the arrival of the Messiah, the world was still in need of healing. The fulfillment of God's promises was only the beginning, and the road ahead would still be long. Her heart continued to pray for the people of Israel and for the entire world, knowing that God's work would take time. In her prayers, Anna knew that patience was not just waiting. It was trusting that God's plan would unfold according to His perfect timing, and that every moment was part of the journey. She could wait because she had faith that God was working in every heart and in every life, bringing about the restoration He had promised. Though Anna's message was now spreading far and wide, she continued to find peace in the quiet sanctuary of the temple. As she entered the temple each day, Anna was reminded that even in a world that was constantly changing, there was one place that remained constant. Her life had been shaped by the temple, by the years of prayer, fasting, and waiting. As the days passed, Anna continued to witness the movement of the Spirit through the hearts of those she had spoken to. And now, as she looked out upon the city of Jerusalem, with a heart full of gratitude and peace, Anna rested in the knowledge that God had been faithful to her throughout her life, and that His promises would continue to unfold in the lives of those who trusted in Him. And whatever you do, whether in word or deed, do it all in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through Him. The sun had begun its slow descent beyond the horizon, casting a golden glow across the small town of Nazareth. Joseph, the humble carpenter, stood in his workshop, his hands worn but steady from a day of hard work. The air was still, save for the occasional rustling of the trees outside, and the scent of freshly cut wood lingered in the air, mingling with the faint scent of evening dew. As Joseph wiped his brow and set his tools aside, he took a moment to survey the work he had done. He looked across the room at the quiet figure of his son, Jesus, who was playing quietly with some simple wooden toys. As Joseph sat down in his favorite chair by the window, his thoughts turned inward. Yet, as the evening light gently filtered through the workshop, Joseph realized that perhaps the key to this responsibility was not in striving for perfection, but in faithfully doing his best, trusting in God's guidance. The quiet moments, like this one, when he could reflect and pray, helped to anchor him. He had been given a purpose in this life, a purpose that stretched beyond the confines of his small workshop. Raising Jesus, guiding him, and showing him the ways of the world was a high calling. Joseph closed his eyes and whispered a prayer in the stillness of the evening, his heart full of gratitude. Joseph had always been a man of quiet strength, one who did not seek attention but preferred the steady, humble work of his hands. He prayed for wisdom, for the wisdom to guide Jesus as he grew. He prayed for the wisdom to know when to speak and when to remain silent, when to guide and when to let go. As he prayed, Joseph felt a deep sense of peace wash over him. The days in the carpenter's workshop were often long, and the work was not always easy. But Joseph had learned to find strength in the Lord, for it was God who gave him the energy to continue. As he looked out the window into the quiet night, he reflected on the strength that God had given him over the years. Joseph smiled softly, recalling the moments of grace he had received through the years. Tonight, as the darkness settled around him, Joseph prayed for the continued strength to care for his family, to fulfill his purpose, and to remain faithful to the task that God had given him. As Joseph prepared to close his workshop for the evening, his heart was full. He reflected on the quiet assurance he had in his heart, an assurance that God's plan was unfolding in His perfect time. With that thought, Joseph knelt by his workbench and offered one final prayer for the evening. As the night deepened and the first stars began to twinkle in the sky, Joseph sat still in his chair, a peaceful silence enveloping him. The rhythmic sounds of his breathing and the faint rustling of the night breeze through the workshop window were all that filled the air. Raising Jesus had not been without its challenges, but Joseph had learned that in every challenge there was an opportunity for growth in his understanding of fatherhood, and more importantly, growth in his relationship with God. Joseph often thought about how Jesus seemed to have such a calm, knowing presence, even as a child. There was an air of wisdom about him that reminded Joseph of the incredible responsibility he had been given. He wasn't just raising any child. He was raising the Son of God. The thought humbled Joseph, but it also filled his heart with a deep gratitude. He had been chosen for this role, and every day he felt a renewed sense of awe at the privilege. His love for Jesus had grown with each passing year, but it was his love for God that sustained him most of all. The next morning, Joseph entered the workshop as the sun began to rise, casting soft golden rays through the wooden beams. Carpenter, though often seen as a humble trade, held for Joseph a sense of purpose. It wasn't just about crafting objects. It was about using the gifts that God had given him to build things that would serve others. He had never once complained about the simplicity of his trade. The workshop had become his sanctuary, a place where he could immerse himself in the act of creation, just as God had created the world. As the day wore on, Joseph took a break, sitting outside his workshop with a mug of water in his hands. There had been many times in his life when the path ahead had been unclear. He thought about the years ahead, the journey that still lay before him. Raising Jesus would only become more challenging as he grew, but Joseph had learned to lean into the peace that came from knowing that God was in control. He didn't need to have all the answers. He just needed to trust. As evening approached once again, Joseph knelt beside his bed, his heart still full from the day's work. Joseph knew that his role as a father would only become more challenging in the coming years. Jesus, though still young, was destined for something great, and the world would not understand him. The challenges they would face as a family were inevitable. With that thought, Joseph bowed his head in prayer, asking God for the strength to endure whatever was ahead. He prayed for courage to face the difficulties, for wisdom to guide Jesus, and for the strength to remain faithful to the task that had been given to him. One evening, as Joseph sat down to dinner with Mary and Jesus, he reflected on the simplicity of their life. There were no grand celebrations, no moments of overwhelming fame. Their life was one of quiet faithfulness, faithfulness to God and to each other. And yet, as Joseph looked at Mary, who smiled lovingly at their son, he realized that this was exactly what God had called them to live ordinary lives filled with extraordinary lives and devotion. The sacredness of their lives was found not in the dramatic events of the world, but in the everyday moments. Cooking dinner, praying together, working side by side in the workshop. He glanced at Jesus, who was silently eating his meal, and his heart swelled with love. The evening air was cool, and the stars sparkled like jewels in the vast, dark sky. Inside, the faint light of an oil lamp flickered softly, casting gentle shadows on the walls. As Joseph reflected on the day's events, his thoughts turned to the future. He wondered what would lie ahead for Jesus and how his life would unfold. Joseph offered a silent prayer of gratitude, thanking God for the peace that filled his heart and for the privilege of being a part of his divine plan. As Joseph sat down in his chair by the workshop's warm light, he closed his eyes for a moment and breathed deeply. He had always valued quietness. There was something deeply soothing about the silence that enveloped his small workshop at the end of a long day. Tonight, Joseph thought about the beauty of simplicity. His thoughts turned to Jesus. The child who had been entrusted to him was growing, and he could already see the light of wisdom in his eyes. The morning sun had already begun to peek over the hills, casting its first rays of light through the cracks in the workshop's walls. Though Joseph had been a carpenter for many years, he never grew tired of the craft. To him, every piece of wood held potential, just as every day held an opportunity to do good work. There was no fanfare in his work, no applause. It was just him and the wood. As he worked, Joseph thought about the example he wanted to set for Jesus. As the day drew to a close, Joseph sat on a stool in the corner of the workshop, his hands resting in his lap. Joseph smiled to himself. Despite the long hours of work, the weariness in his bones, and the challenges of raising a family in a world that didn't understand them, there was something incredibly beautiful in the faithfulness of their lives. The simplicity of their existence was a testimony to the truth that God was present in all things, even in the most ordinary of moments. The beauty of faithful work, Joseph realized, was that it didn't require recognition or rewards. It was enough to know that he had done his best, that he had fulfilled his purpose for the day. He prayed for the strength to continue in this humble work, for the wisdom to raise Jesus well, and for the peace to trust in God's plan. As the night fell and the sounds of the day quieted down, he had always trusted God's plan, even when it wasn't clear to him. As Joseph offered one last prayer before retiring for the evening, he asked God for the strength to continue trusting in his plan, even when the road ahead was uncertain. He prayed for the courage to follow God's lead and for the peace to accept whatever came his way. With that prayer, Joseph went inside, knowing that whatever the future held, God would be with him every step of the way. The evening was unusually still. with not a sound in the air except for the distant rustling of trees. He often took these moments of stillness to reflect on his role as a father and husband. As he sat in the dimly lit room, Joseph's thoughts turned to the many challenges they had faced and would continue to face. The next day dawned with a golden light spilling over the hills of Nazareth. Joseph was already at work when the sun rose, his hands steady and sure as he shaped the wood before him. He had always believed that work itself was sacred. He paused for a moment, looking at the project in front of him. As the days passed, Joseph found himself relying more and more on patience. Joseph reflected on how patient God had been with him. That evening, as Joseph sat quietly in his workshop, he thanked God for the gift of patience. He asked for strength to continue walking this path with trust and perseverance. As nightfall descended, Joseph found himself thinking about Mary, his wife, his partner in life, and the mother of Jesus. She had been through so much, from the angel's announcement to the long journey to Bethlehem, and now the daily challenges of raising a child who was destined for greatness. He prayed for her that night, asking God to continue to bless her with wisdom, strength, and peace.
He prayed that God would surround her with peace and reassurance, that she would continue to feel his presence in her life. Joseph knew that they were in this together, and that their partnership in faith was a vital part of God's plan. With a deep sigh, Joseph offered his prayer, trusting that God would continue to bless their family with everything they needed.
The night was calm as Joseph closed the door to the workshop and made his way to the small room he shared with Mary. As he sat beside Mary, who was already preparing for sleep, Joseph felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. He had been entrusted with the responsibility of caring for the Son of God, and though the weight of that responsibility was heavy, it was also a source of deep joy. He knew that God had not called him to do this work alone. God was with him, guiding him every step of the way. Joseph leaned back against the wall, taking a deep breath. The peace of God's presence filled the room, and with that peace came the reassurance that everything would be okay. As the evening set in, Joseph felt the familiar peace of the night settle around him. The workshop, now dimly lit by the soft glow of a candle, seemed to stand still in the quiet of the hour. The work for the day had come to a close, and Joseph allowed himself a moment to relax, his thoughts drifting towards the family he so deeply loved. In the stillness of the night, Joseph often reflected on how he had learned to trust God's plan, even when it seemed unclear. Joseph had learned that there was strength in quiet trust. His work as a carpenter did not bring him worldly praise, but he found purpose and strength in knowing that each task he completed Each prayer he uttered was part of God's greater plan. God saw it all, and that was enough. That night, after the household had gone to bed, Joseph found himself alone in the workshop again, his mind turning to the future. Joseph felt the weight of the responsibility on his heart, but in that moment he also found peace. As he worked quietly on a piece of wood, Joseph offered a prayer for Jesus' future. He asked God to give him the wisdom to raise Jesus in a way that honored God's will, to help him provide guidance and protection. Joseph knew that his role was not to control Jesus' future, but to be faithful in the present, to nurture Jesus, to love him, and to point him towards the Father. As Joseph continued to work in the soft glow of his workshop, his thoughts turned to the quiet, everyday moments that filled his life. From fixing a broken chair to sharing a quiet meal, Joseph found joy in the simple moments of fatherhood. He remembered the first time he had held Jesus as a baby, the overwhelming sense of awe he had felt as he looked into the tiny face of the one who would change the world. In the years since, he had learned that fatherhood was not always about having all the answers, but being present in the moments that mattered. Joseph's heart was filled with gratitude as he thought of the trust God had placed in him to raise Jesus. Later that evening, after his work was finished, Joseph sat by the fire in the small room he shared with Mary. As they sat together in the quiet, Joseph thought about the peace that filled his heart. He had been given a family, a purpose, and the peace of knowing that God was with them. There was so much uncertainty in the world, so many things Joseph couldn't control. But in the stillness of their home, Joseph found peace in knowing that God was present, guiding them through every moment. With a sigh of contentment, Joseph closed his eyes. As the night stretched on, Joseph sat at his workbench, his hands carefully sanding a piece of wood. At times, he had struggled with uncertainty, with wondering if he was doing enough or if he was on the right path. But over the years, Joseph had come to understand that trusting God's timing was one of the most important aspects of faith. His life had unfolded not according to his own plans, but according to God's. And though the road had not always been easy, Joseph had found peace in knowing that God's timing was always perfect. Joseph finished his work for the evening and stood up, stretching his tired muscles. With a final prayer of thanks, Joseph extinguished the candle and prepared for bed. As the evening grew quieter, Joseph found himself reflecting on the nature of true service. He thought about how, in many ways, his life life mirrored that of Jesus. As Joseph worked, he offered a silent prayer of gratitude. He thanked God for the ability to serve, for the opportunity to contribute to the world in small but meaningful ways. The night was falling, and Joseph, as he often did, sat by the small fire with Mary, reflecting on their life together. The sound of their breathing, steady and calm, was a comfort after the long day. Joseph's heart was filled with gratitude for his family. Mary was his child, entrusted to him by God, and Joseph felt the weight of that responsibility deeply. But in that quiet moment, Joseph was also filled with peace. He realized that family was one of the greatest gifts God had given him. Joseph whispered a prayer of thanks for the gift of family, for the joy they brought into his life, and for the love that bound them together. As the night stretched on, Joseph sat alone for a while, deep in prayer. Joseph knew that prayer was a powerful tool, not because it changed God's mind. Tonight, as Joseph knelt in the quiet of his workshop, he asked for continued strength to fulfill his role as a father, husband, and servant of God. He prayed for the wisdom to guide Jesus and Mary in the days ahead, trusting that God would lead them in all things. The days were growing shorter, and the air had a slight chill as winter approached. But Joseph found warmth in the simple moments of life, in his daily work, and in the time spent with Mary and Jesus. The quiet beauty of his life was a testament to the truth that God's plan, though sometimes mysterious, was always good. As he worked late into the evening, Joseph thought about how far he had come. Joseph's life, though quiet and simple, was filled with purpose. He knew that God had chosen him for a reason, to be the earthly father of Jesus. This role, this purpose, was greater than anything he had ever imagined. And as he finished his work for the evening and prepared for bed, Joseph offered a prayer of surrender. He asked God to continue guiding his family and to help him embrace his plan with faith and trust. He knew that whatever lay ahead, God would be faithful to them. The night had settled in, and Joseph was exhausted, but his heart was full. The work of the day was complete, and his family was safe and sound. Mary and Jesus were already asleep, and Joseph felt a deep sense of gratitude for the life he had been given. He knelt by the side of his bed, offering one final prayer before he closed his eyes for the night. As Joseph lay down to sleep, he felt a deep sense of calm. The challenges of the day had been met, and he trusted that tomorrow would bring its own blessings.